Lesson 9 is going to focus on what we call bibliotherapy and its relevance for teaching of Jewish texts in general, and more specifically for teaching of biblical texts and biblical characters in particular. What we're going to do over the course of this session is the following. First, we're going to talk a little bit about what is the whole field of bibliotherapy. What are we trying to do in bibliotherapy? What are some of the components of bibliotherapy? In other words, how does it fit in to an educational setting? And there are various forms of bibliotherapy, and we're going to look at it in terms of, as we'll discuss in greater detail, in terms of actual therapy in a more clinical sense. But what I would argue, and this has been shown in various studies, is the appropriateness and the relevance of bibliotherapy for education as well. We will talk more specifically about bibliotherapy and Tanakh study. In other words, when I adopt this approach of bibliotherapy in the context of teaching Tanakh, what does that mean? Is it the same as using bibliotherapy for any type of modern prose or fiction? Are there differences? And if so, I believe there are, then we have to be aware of their possibilities as well as aware of the possible limitations or considerations that we have to take into account. We will also look at an example of how you might use bibliotherapy to teach a specific portion of Tanakh. We will focus here on the chapter 32 from the book of Breshit, from the book of Genesis, the story that describes Jacob sending messengers to Esau. And what is that all about? And on one level, but our focus in this context will be what types of bibliotherapy messages can be drawn from this study, and how could it be made more relevant for our students. So that's our agenda for this lesson, and we will begin now with a very general understanding about what bibliotherapy is all about and what it's trying to do. And I will actually, at the end of this portion, I will refer you to a talk by Dr. Elizabeth Tail Pearson, which I think is very moving, very powerful, where she really discusses the theory of bibliotherapy and its practical implications within educational settings. So bibliotherapy literally involves treatment through books. In other words, using books, biblio in the sense of books, as an opportunity to treat people. But once again, I'm referring to treatment not only in terms of clinical psychological treatment, but I would refer to education through books. And another definition is guided reading of written materials to help the reader grow in self-awareness. In other words, using different types of reading materials as an opportunity for the reader to grow, to reflect on where they are up to try and encounter some of the issues that they are addressing or that they're confronting, and to try and help, as it's written here, in their own self-awareness. The third definition, which I bring in from Schroeds, is the process of dynamic interaction between the personality of the reader and literature under the guidance of a trained helper. And here, there's a clear emphasis on the dynamic interaction between the reader as a person, as an individual, and the literature, on the other hand, and the critical link here between the literature and the reader is the guidance of a trained helper. And that, in our context, really refers to, obviously, the role of the educator. Now, what are some of the benefits of bibliotherapy? So, first of all, bibliotherapy increases awareness of and empathetic understanding for other cultures, lifestyles, and lived experiences. It helps us be exposed to the other. It helps us learn more about different types of cultures, which may not be an opportunity which we encounter on our day-to-day, and therefore, in that sense, it helps us reach other spheres which may not be as clearly accessible for us. 2, it provides a mirror. It increases our appreciation of and pride and identification with one's own identity, culture, and ethnicity. In that sense, it allows us to examine ourselves and to think about what is our identity all about, what is our culture all about, and our ethnicity all about. It promotes coping skills. It allows us to understand and appreciate life's challenges and relieve emotional or mental pressure. When you read a story which engages you, when you read a story that really touches on a particular nerve that is sensitive for you, then that helps relieve some of the emotional or mental pressure that we are undergoing. So, what are some of the benefits of bibliotherapy? First of all, it provides information and alternative solutions to a problem. In other words, it allows our students to have additional channels of information. They learn more about the situation, and at the same time, it also provides them with a variety of solutions to a problem. So, for instance, if we've just read a story about a very painful divorce, that, first of all, allows students to understand. So it provides them with additional information about what the critical issue for them of divorce is all about. And at the same time, it provides them with different types of solutions that children, perhaps in the story, have come up with to cope with the various difficulties or challenges that they are facing. So in that sense, it provides information as well as solutions. It stimulates discussion of feelings and ideas. And in that sense, what bibliotherapy is doing in an educational setting is it's a group structure. It uses the group as an opportunity to discuss feelings and ideas. Now, we'll discuss this a little bit later in more detail, but at this point, I want to mention the importance of creating a safe space for our children in this setting. In other words, if we are not certain that there's a sense of security and that the children feel that they can share some of their deepest feelings, then my recommendation would be avoid any dealing with bibliotherapy, because in that sense, under those circumstances, it can be more detrimental than helpful. It also increases our enjoyment of literature and reading. When children read a story that speaks to them, when children read a story that provides them with information for issues, challenges that are meaningful and relevant for their lives, it obviously increases their enjoyment of the act of reading and allows them to see a new side of literature which they will carry with them, which will be meaningful for them for the rest of their lives. There are 2 types of bibliotherapy. There is one which is called developmental, which is using literature to assist individuals in dealing with transitional and normal developmental issues. In other words, as we grow, as we develop, as we encounter new kinds of issues and challenges throughout life, and transitional periods are critical, this is one form of bibliotherapy. There's another form, which is clinical, which refers to medical clinicians meeting a deliberate therapeutic goal for the purpose of assisting individuals in dealing with severe disorders and traumatic life experiences. This is much more within the realm of medical work, medical and clinical work, and we are not by any stretch of the imagination advocating clinical bibliotherapy, but rather we are referring to the developmental, which really broaches some of the issues that we as people encounter as we move from one stage to the other. Now, how can bibliotherapy help children? We can use it in a number of different ways: adoption and foster care, bullying, and here you can use stories from the Bible as opportunities to illustrate this. death and dying, a critical issue in children's development. And certainly there are many, I think, outstanding examples of death and dying in the Bible, as well as some of the rabbinic literature, which can be used to raise these issues of death and dying. Disabilities and handicaps, divorce, separation, stepfamilies. Here too, we have an abundance of different kinds of biblical narratives that relate to some of these painful and challenging situations. Alcoholism and abuse, nutrition and healthy eating, and finally anger management. And once again, the biblical stories have a number of different contexts in which anger management surfaces. And in this context, I'd like to refer you to a book that unfortunately only appears in Hebrew by Professor Adir Cohen, which is called Jewish Bibliotherapy. And for those of you who are able to read and understand Hebrew, I highly recommend this book by Professor Adir Cohen. It appears on our course bibliography, and therefore I would encourage you to try and refer to it. Okay, so how does it work? How does bibliotherapy work? There are 4 key stages that we're going to focus on. First of all, there's identification or projection. Then there's catharsis, insight, and universalization. Let's go into each one of these in greater detail. So the first one of identification, the reader or the student identifies with a book character. In other words, I read the story about Joseph and his brothers, and I say, I identify with the brothers because the brothers speak to me because I see the youngest son as being obnoxious, as being someone who really teases us and tries to find favor in our father's eyes. 2, it's catharsis. The child becomes emotionally involved in the story and is able to release pent-up emotions. Once again, if we take the story of Joseph and his brothers, or if we take the story of David and his brothers in the book of Samuel 1, chapter 17, where he really, he's the youngest in his family, and he goes and he saves the entire Israelite people. Well, one of his brothers responds to that in a very negative way. So you have here the cathartic issue of, okay, I have all of this anger towards my older brothers, or I have all this anger towards my younger brother or sister. That can all surface in this stage of catharsis. The third is insight. And here what we're talking about is after the catharsis, so the youngster thinks, well, what does this mean for me? How does this help me search for a solution to the problems that were faced by the character in the book? And what does this mean for me as a growing individual? And finally, it's universalization. The youngster understands that his or her problems are not alone. They aren't just theirs. And they realize that they are not isolated. And this is comforting and important because to a certain extent, what this does is this allows the child to understand that they are in this as part of a growing experience. And it's not just their specific problem, but rather this is part of growing up. And in that sense, I think that this is enormously valuable for a child who feels as though they are not alone, they have a support system, and to a large extent, they're able to discuss this within a safe environment. Now, how should bibliotherapy be conducted? We have to motivate the individual with introductory activities. In other words, we don't just start straight off with the book or with the piece of literature, but rather we do different types of exercises, perhaps which involve more movement or more music, which really touch on other types of educational or different types of intelligences. Then we provide time for reading the material. We have to allow our students the opportunity to read, to understand, to question what's going on in the story. Then you have to allow incubation time. Incubation time means that we have to allow our students to think about it and to try and figure out what is going on here. And then we have to provide follow-up discussion. We bring the group together as a group. We use questions that will, first of all, allow the children to demonstrate that they've understood what's going on here, that they've internalized some of the information, and then that they are prepared to understand and evaluate that information. In other words, that they can critically look at this information and then finally to conduct an evaluation. In other words, they've looked at this information, they've tried to synthesize it, and then they come to the fifth step, which is really the final step of this process, where they say, okay, I've gone through this whole process, I've thought about this story, I've thought about how that touches my own life, I've tried to think about what are some of the implications for me, and then I come to the critical final stage of evaluating, okay, what does this mean for me in my life at this particular time? And in that sense, what we've tried to do is we've tried to go through the various stages and try to show how each one blends into the previous ones on a macro issue. In the next clip, what we will do is we will actually go through the specific steps in order to try to see how we take this to the more micro level of using bibliotherapy in the classroom.